My name is Clodagh Malone. I'm nearly 53. I was born in a mother and baby home in Dublin, the capital of Ireland. My mother was in England, pregnant with me, and the Catholic Church in Ireland had a claw even going to England, and she was put in a boat 5 days before my birth, and she was incarcerated into St. Patrick's Mother and Baby Home. And I was with her there for 10 weeks. And then I went out to my new respectable adopted family. What I work at, I suppose, my bread and butter is property. And I learned that from my adopted mother. But my passion is I am a search angel in Ireland. There's only kind of maybe 2 or 3 of us. I do that voluntary, try to reunite families with their blood, because the system in Ireland is very corrupt with the Catholic Church and with the government, and trying to hide, seal files, and things are getting a little bit easier now. So I've been doing it, I suppose, for 12 years. My parents separated when I was about 3 years old. Not great to be adopted into a family that's supposed to be Catholic and normal and middle class. My relationship with my adopted mother was good, but quite strained at times, because she was overcompensating and wasn't allowing me to be free. There's a great saying, a man doesn't become wise until he falls on the streets, and cuts his knee, and I just wasn't allowed to do that. So it was my mother, my adopted mother, who told me when I was about, I'd say about 4 or 5. But it was kind of like the Cabbage Patch kind of story, that you were found in a cabbage patch. But I know growing up, you don't belong. You're not with your people. You don't look like these people. These people are strangers. I'm writing a book, Made to Love Strangers. And that is very true, because they're not our people, they're not our DNA, and it's nature versus nurture. So I always knew that there was something, I just couldn't put my finger on it. And then eventually you're adopted, and didn't really take that in. And as life then goes on, somebody on the street will tell you you're adopted. And so sadly, your adoption is never secret. Everybody else knows you're adopted. It's like a stain. And some children can be very cruel. So when I was told, my adopted mother was great. She was very hedonistic in a way, and we lived a very different kind of life. I remember, I think it was my 6th or 7th birthday, and I was up visiting my dad and his girlfriend. She remembers me saying, it was my birthday, and she said, I turned around and said, somebody very special is thinking about me today. And she said she didn't know what to say. And that's now my father's girlfriend. So I've had 3 mothers. It's very confusing. I've had a stepmother, a birth mother, and an adopted mother. With my adopted mother, it was never discussed being adopted. Never. Birthdays, searching, never. I did get a piece of paper she gave me from the Catholic Rescue Protection, and it said, my date of birth and my weight and my feeding regime. And that's the first time I saw my real name was Aileen. So it had Aileen on it. So I've always called myself Clodagh Aileen. But absolutely, you were not allowed to discuss your adoption, because here in Ireland, like, adoption is, you're from a dirty thing. If you came from a mother and baby home, basically your mother was a whore or a prostitute or, a Magdalene woman, a sinner. And believe it or not, I only found out maybe in my 30s that I was born in a mother and baby home. I knew that I was born somewhere in Dublin, but because it's not in the history books in Ireland, I didn't know that St. Patrick's, where I was born, was the largest mother and baby home in Ireland, and 6,000 children perished in that home. So looking at the mortality, we were dirt. And they only realised then, with the Adoption Act coming in and 60s, 70s, we were then becoming currency. And that's why we were going out to Catholic middle class families. So it was never discussed about being adopted. I was mortified that I was adopted. I couldn't say the word adoption. I would go blood red. So society had instilled that in me, that I was a sinner. But in fact, I was a survivor. My adopted mother was a model before, obviously, she adopted me. But there's a twist, because there was another girl adopted before me. And this is when they were living in England. My mum went out and my father said he didn't want to adopt, and that she came home with this scrawny baby one day. Now, I know that there's obviously a story behind it, but there's a 6-month window with adoption where the birth mother can change her mind. My parents decided to come back to Ireland. My dad was a professional golfer. He was captain of the Irish golf team. So his work would bring him around a lot. So she was taken back. And then I was adopted. So my brother said one time in a row, he said, you weren't first choice, you weren't second choice, you were third choice. Cheers for that. So, yes, growing up, my mother was very different features, very striking features, but very kind of chiseled features. I was always a small, kind of roundish child, and I looked very different. And my mum just had a very beautiful woman, and she'd have red hair, flaming red hair. And I had very dark hair growing up. But we were very different, like our frame was very different. I think she had a bit of an eating disorder as well, which did kind of come on to me. I went the other way, because I wasn't going to be pushed by anybody. But yeah, I certainly knew, it's like Christmas Day and any time that there were gatherings, I didn't look like any of them. And I didn't have any of their personalities. You know, they were all very serious. I just wanted the crack, that's what we say in Ireland. Fun, always up for a laugh, trying to be very positive. So everywhere, I suppose the body, the mind, and the soul, the three psyches, very different values as well. You know, and my intelligence was very different. And people knew. Like, Ireland's a very small country. It's only about 3 million in the whole of Ireland in the 1980s. And everybody knows, because I'm Malone and say somebody Walsh. The Walshes all look like each other and they're from that little pocket in Ireland. But no, I never looked like any of them. My brother was, I think 8 years older than me. And when I was brought home, he didn't take too kindly to it at all. And now we get on wonderful. You know, in hindsight, as life goes on, he's quite unwell at the moment. So we're kind of reunited. And the funny commonality that we have, even though we're not blood, is our mother. And we love to talk about her because she was so eccentric and great fun. He had his own issues growing up. He was a very, very different child to me. I would class now what people say is ADHD. And he had to deal with that himself. Again, he never referred to me as his adopted sister. Like, his girlfriends for years didn't know I was adopted. And then when they found out, but like looking at me and looking at the photographs, you'd know. But we get on, yeah, well. I was about 9 and there was an order beside us where actually Pope Francis came in the 80s. It was a well-known seminary in Dublin. And the lady lived in apartments beside. We lived in this Georgian house. She was a single mother. My mother was a single mother, lone parent. And this woman was a cook up in the seminary. So we used to walk up. My mum was very religious. She'd go to mass twice a day. And we would walk up and I'd go into the kitchen. You might get a bowl of soup or it's just something different, you know. And I wasn't aware who this man was. But I got a little job gardening. And my mum used to drop me up. And I don't know, it was, I think, once a week, every week or whatever. But the abuse started immediately. And my poor mother didn't know. And I'm so grateful that she didn't know. because it would have broken her heart. She was, as I said, she was overcompensating. So this happened a dozen times. I think that part of the trauma is still locked in that inner child, and bit by bit it's coming out. That man, the Clodagh God, used to stalk the house where I lived, and he would be across the road. I couldn't get away from him. And the fear, I will never forget the fear. And he'd be walking the opposite side of the street and grooming. But I hated him. I detested him. I couldn't understand why I was being dropped to this little job. And I was getting a $5 to be abused for an hour. And I thought it was just part of perhaps being adopted. All this is going through my tiny mind that can't compartmentalise, what's really going on. The fact he was a paedophile, and paedophiles, whether it's 40 years ago or now, are rampant. The priest years ago in Ireland used to go in, have a cup of tea with the parents and say, I'll just pop upstairs, say to Johnny, and I'll read him a story. That's how a lot of abuse happened. But it's just to be mindful, watchful, let the children have their childhood as well. But just what happened to me, I couldn't tell anybody because I was only 10 years of age. It happened multiple times. Because, again, ingrained in my mind, I thought that I'd be sent back to the home. My adoptive mother was ingrained in religiosity. That's what Ireland was like. And she would go to Mass twice a day. She just loved Mass. And the Padre Pio glove, she would go around and bless people with it. She was a Catholic, but she was a good Christian. And I don't know where my head was at. Like, I used to go to this religious sodality, it was called, every Wednesday. And I had an altar in my bedroom. And I was going to become a nun. I wanted to become a nun. And I think after the abuse and then kind of I discovered boys very early. And Catholicism was almost like a superstition here in Ireland. You could go up the road and murder somebody, but if you went to Mass and got Holy Communion, it was fine. And women were very downtrodden in Ireland. It did go upon me, the Catholic fear. You didn't have sex outside marriage. And if I got pregnant, say if I was 17 or 18, I would have been sent to a mother and baby home, without a shadow. So going through life, I was in many different schools. I was expelled, just trauma. And then I left home as quick as I could to live with my boyfriend, because and he was adopted as well, from a mother and baby home. So we weren't a great team, two traumatized people. And then I got pregnant at 20, and I had my first child at 21. Coming from a middle class family, you didn't do that kind of thing. And particularly being adopted, you just didn't. I thought it was a very joyous occasion for me. Everybody else seemed to think that my life was over. So there was talk of perhaps termination, which isn't legal in Ireland. It is now in 2023, but it wasn't back in 1990. Or give up my child. And there was no way that I was giving up my flesh and blood. But a social worker did come when she was 2 days old, trying to get me to give her up. And I basically told her to F off and pick a window, because my child was coming home with me. I was very headstrong growing up, very determined. I wouldn't be bullied by anybody. The epiphany happened once I gave birth. And I looked at my child and what I had gone through and what I had nurtured for 9 months, and given this child life. And there was nobody taking her from me, absolutely not. And if I had to be a single mother, so be it. And a lot of adoptees have given up their own children. I don't know the circumstances. Being a surgeon, well, I do know a lot of bad circumstances, but it's not as unusual as people would think. Going through life then, I got pregnant with my second child quite quickly. That was when I was 24. 23, sorry. So as time went on and I'm looking at my own children, then you kind of see it's a whole different ball game. You start seeing that your children look like you, and the whole process of what was done and how unnatural it was to take a child from their birth mother, their blood, their kin, as we say in Ireland. Going through life, I overcompensated with my own children. I wanted them to not go through what I went through. And I can't explain to people what it's like adoption, unless you're adopted yourself. So then Facebook, revolutionary really for survivors. Then you start getting involved in other groups and you see all what's going on. And then you understand. You start going, there's something wrong with me. So I went to see a psychiatrist and I was diagnosed with severe PTSD. But that was also from, I was abused at the age of 10. So I've only come out about that recently. And I do believe, you know, I've confronted all of that and it's all sorted. But I do believe if I wasn't adopted and I hadn't come from a mother and baby home, I do believe that I wouldn't have been sexually abused by a priest. You're at a disadvantage every which way because you're vulnerable and you're not told why you're vulnerable and you're grieving and you're just basically told, be grateful, get on with it. But I'm not grateful. What was done to me, taken from my mother and taking my identity and my medical history and everything. We're ballsy people, adoptees, because we have so much more of a fight than other children. We're also 3 to 4 times more likely to be abused being adopted, sadly. In 1994, my adopted mum died and I was pregnant with my second child. So I gave birth 2 months later, kind of going through the grieving, terrible grieving for my adopted mother. And I again went, maybe I'll look for my natural mother, birth mother. We have very many different terms, so I don't want to insult anybody. So I contacted the agency that looked after my adoption. And I went in and I met the same social worker who was involved in my adoption, who had some shenanigans with my father. So it wasn't great placing me in an unstable. So I met her and she's dead now. She just said to me that I wouldn't get on with my birth mother, first mother, that she was effervescent. Sure, I didn't know what that was when I was 24, 25. And we started writing letters to each other. And she'd sign off like, Deo Gracias, which is thank God. So I kind of went, this woman's religious. And then we exchanged photographs and then we met and I had a panic attack. I couldn't get my head around. She was showing me photographs. She was telling me about Irish dancing. She was a champion Irish dancer. I wasn't prepared and I couldn't. Eventually, when we were looking for our cars to say goodbye, I had a full-blown panic attack. Couldn't find the car. It was just, I found the whole thing very overwhelming, very traumatic. So looking back now, I suppose at my age, nearly 30 years on, what was I looking for? I think I was looking for a replacement. So my mother was 23 when she found herself pregnant, which is quite old to give a child up in Ireland at that time. But she was in a relationship with my father and found out that he was cheating. So she went to England, whether it was to flee, the Catholic Church, or to have a termination, I don't know. But she then eventually presented herself to the Catholic Rescue Protection in England. And if you were unwed, that's it. You weren't keeping your child. You were in a home or you would go to a hospital. You could not come home. You wouldn't get a job. You wouldn't get a flat. You were a blackened woman. Nobody would marry you. I wouldn't say that she didn't choose adoption, because even in the letters from her, which I have, she didn't want to part with me, but she knew it was the best thing for me and for her. I think 97% of unwed mothers in the 60s and 70s gave up their children. that high. And sadly, my birth mother, first mother, because so much time had passed with the two of us being separated, we just couldn't bond. Even though she had a son who was 10 years younger than me from her marriage. Her marriage had broken up. She was in addiction. I think she was a very heavy drinker. I didn't realise that at the time. And since she's died, I suppose it's all come out how badly traumatised she was in the home. They were horrendous to the women in the homes in Ireland. The brutality. So how could, I suppose, we kind of form a relationship when I don't know that I'm in PTSD? The anxiety I used to suffer, and she's in addiction and PTSD, it just, we couldn't. As much as we tried, we couldn't. So when I met my birth mother, first mother, she was in her, well, I was 24, she was about 47, and very well dressed, very attractive woman. But as time went on, she became very resentful towards me that she couldn't give her son what my adopted mother had given me, which was an education. I got a good education. And of course, I'd be looking going, but you kept him. And he had his mother. I had a mother, but she wasn't my blood mother. And there is a big difference. I met him once, and my birth mother kind of turned him against me. And that happens an awful lot in reunions when they don't work out, that the mother will turn the children that she's kept against the adopted. So it's not that he turned on me, he just cut contact, but just all that whole thing of blocking. We just won't talk about the elephant in the room. And when she died last November, I tried through cousins to contact him, and I was basically told no, and that I wasn't to go to the funeral. So it's kind of like, shine up your leper bell and keep going, because nobody, like none of my birth family want to know me, you know, and a lot of them I've never even met, but it's been turned in a way that I am a bad person. It's very strange, you know, because of some mother's guilt of having to give her child up, all of a sudden she turns on her own child. So that's what adoption is, you know, it's rejection after rejection, and then you just have to stop putting yourself out there and saying enough is enough, because you will become unwell. Some mothers, sadly, in Ireland believe that us adoptees are not entitled to compensation. There is a compensation scheme coming out at the end of this year, 2023, hope maybe 2024, that if you were in a home as a mother, you're entitled to a certain sum of money. As an adoptee, if you're in over 6 months, you're only entitled after 6 months, which is very cruel and has put a split in the community. But some mothers who have been resentful towards their children, and it hasn't worked out, and it doesn't work out an awful lot of time with these people that I reunite or that look themselves, they believe that us adoptees didn't suffer anything and that we're not entitled to compensation. And the biggest suffering in your life is from the day you're born, that your life is mapped out for you by other people, and that you're going to be taken off your mother. And I think that that's the biggest punishment that you can do to a human being, and mother and a child when they're in such a vulnerable situation, you know. So with the mothers, I won't fight with people. Everybody, we live in a democracy, everybody's entitled to their opinion, but I think it's wrong. I think it's very wrong, and I think enough research hasn't been done into adoptees and the trauma. And in the line of my work as a search angel, I can't talk at all about the searches I do, but it's horrendous what I find out. The trauma behind the pregnancy. Some people I have searched for have taken their lives when they came up against, I suppose, a blank wall, or their mother didn't want to see them, or they found out that what they were a result of, which was a very violent act. A lot of priests in this country have impregnated young women that have been given up for adoption. There's nothing joyous about adoption or researching, but it gives people a sense of belonging. I was 41 when I was diagnosed with cervical cancer. That cancer that I had wasn't hereditary. Cervical cancer isn't necessarily hereditary. It's the HPV virus. Just went for a regular smear. They kept calling me back, and eventually I had a full hysterectomy and part of my bowel taken. And I knew that I would have some rest up time, so I set up the group Beyond Adoption Ireland, and we have about 3,000 members, and it's a very encompassing group that, unlike other adopted groups in Ireland, I don't know outside of Ireland, that it's open to foster mothers, adopted mothers, adoptees, siblings who are looking for long lost families. There's no in-house fighting or bullying. So that's kind of what I do, I suppose, in my voluntary time. And then I do a bit of counselling with survivors, particularly the mothers. When I really got into the history of it and the brutality of what was being done to children, and we were parts of experiments, how our mothers were treated, and I've always, just a sense of justice has always been in me. It's like you go and do a degree, you have to learn and learn and learn, and it's so difficult. And then I was learning about how to find birth certs, the tricks of the trade. I wasn't doing anything illegal, but I just learned very quickly how to beat the system. And the system told me to stop doing it, TUSLA, and I told them I will never stop doing what I'm doing, because adoptees in Ireland, unlike England, England you get your birth certificate, your original birth certificate. We don't. Everything's under lock and key. The only thing I had was Aileen, not my second name, so I didn't know where to search, or my mother's name, you know, father unknown. Then I went to Brussels, I went to the European Parliament, and then it got bigger and bigger, and I suppose then people start ringing you looking for magazine, radio interviews. Radio interviews are my favourite. And then just as time goes, you can't turn your back. These people in the government, I'm not frightened of them, whereas a lot of other adoptees have that gratefulness in them and that fear of authority. I don't. And I work with another man, he's written a book, The Adoption Machine. That's by Paul Redmond. It's very good. The History of Ireland and Magdalen Laundries. We looked for the Commission of Inquiry. That was started in 2014, and that was a bunch of judges or whatever. But we said there has to be a commission of investigation into what went into these homes. So we got that. It was a waste of time. Anything with the government in this country when it comes to mother and baby homes is a waste of time. So now we just have to look after our ageing community, which are the mothers and the adoptees, and there is a new legislation, it's birthinfo.ie, that people send off, but the usual, you're waiting about 3 months. But we got there, and it was like a poison chalice that we were handed, and we just couldn't just walk away. I couldn't walk away. And because I knew I had somewhat of a, I suppose, is it a better life or more of a survival kind of skill than other people had. So it's taken 12 years to reach this point. And let me tell you, it doesn't just happen going in front of the media. I mean, there's been many times that Xanaxes had to be taken because I was so frightened. I knew I had to do it, but the anxiety is crippling because you're not trained for this. You're not in a salary for it. It's just a passion. I kind of know a survivor of industrial schools or mother and baby homes because they always carry a lot of bags with them. And it's the psychology of it is that's their life in those bags. So when you go to meet them to help them with the search, or I do DNA, or I might go to a graveyard with them, everything is presented to you, and you have to be very respectful. In that bag is their life, what they have been through. And like other people have albums and albums, don't they, of photographs, but adoptees, I think I've one photograph of when I was a baby. I met the Pope in 2018. He came to Ireland. There was much uproar, people with protests and their own kind of agenda or whatever. I met him in the capacity of being a search angel. I asked him, would he address the Irish nation to say that it wasn't a mortal sin for a mother or a child to look for each other, because they were told by the nuns in the homes that it was a mortal sin. So that opened the floodgates for mothers to come out of hiding, because Ireland is just, it's not as Catholic as it was, but for them to realise that the Pope, like the next man to God, because a lot of these older women are very religious, said it wasn't a mortal sin. The government, the floodgates for their searches, the floodgates for my searches, it was just incredible. After meeting the Pope, I was at a meeting for other survivors. It was a worldwide thing that Pope Francis wanted minority groups to meet and see how we can change things in the Catholic Church. And I electively came out to the other people. There were only 8 of us that met the Pope, and I told them that I felt a bit of a fraud, that I had been abused, but I still didn't know it was a brother priest. I thought it was, believe it or not, I thought it was a down and out, maybe adopted or industrial school survivor. I don't know where that came in my mind. So in fairness, the Catholic Church did their research and they came back to me and they said, you actually were abused by Douglas Peace-Pill, and he abused another boy, but not in the same place. And so I had to, that was the most difficult time in my life, having gone through the mother and baby homes, now the sex abuse. That's when I saw the psychiatrist, diagnosed, having to relive the whole thing and how demonic it was. And again, combining it with being adopted, and that man saw me as nothing to do that to me, and literally take away my childhood. I came out in the media, the Sunday Times. It would be a very big newspaper, and anything I had done before was always about other survivors. I've told my story about my mother and that, but when I did come out, and it was hard to come out, that the amount of emails that I got from my school friends that had been abused, same as myself, they think it's courage coming out. I don't see it as courage. I wanted that man's name in the newspaper forever. And I also wanted that other victim, because the Catholic Church were kind of holding back and saying, don't know if we can find his email. And I said, right, I'm going to go public. And some of my family said to me, I wouldn't have done it. But it does take courage, and it releases, and it's cathartic to talk about your experience and keep talking about it, and never to be ashamed, because you did nothing wrong. Last mother and baby home closed in 1996 in Ireland, but at that stage the welfare system was good. It wasn't such a stigma. Girls were hanging on to their children. So what's happened now in Ireland, there's no adoptions in Ireland unless it's, maybe a stepfather adopting, in a kinship or whatever. So now is that our government agency is taking children from homes, and rightfully so if the children are being abused, absolutely. But sadly, these children are being lost in the system. And I see in 20 years' time, we're going to have the same epidemic, I suppose, for want of a better word, with foster children. They're being taken out of their environment and what they know. And I don't know whether it's worse being adopted or whether it's worse being taken at an older age. And they're being put into a system because there's a lot of money for a couple or a single person to foster a child in Ireland. So yeah, no children are being adopted. We had abortion termination introduced a couple of years ago in Ireland as well. But things are very different compared to 50 odd years ago when I was in a home. And particularly in Ireland, I don't know with other countries, the rate of addiction, but not, it would be to prescription medication, to alcohol. And I find with a lot of Irish adoptees, they don't drink anymore because they perhaps are frightened of a place that it has brought them, of that grieving. Because whatever this thing about adoption, or again, it's all religious, it's man-made, it was the cruelest experiment that was ever done to humankind. And then, as I say, going on to the abuse and what happens after that. And it's lovely. We'll bring a little baby home and that baby will love us and call us mum and dad. And it sadly, it does not happen that way. And with, I suppose, adopted mothers, because I gave a talk in my school there a couple of years ago, and they've actually adopted quite a lot of overseas babies because there's none in Ireland. And IVF just, it didn't work for them. I didn't realise, given the speech. And I just said, like, every child needs to know where they came from. And some of them came up to me afterwards and kind of went, didn't think about that. What am I going to tell? And I said, they need to know their culture, their heritage, their language, their food. You can't take that away. And I know people won't like me saying this. Adoption can be a very selfish thing. And I think the reason my own adopted mother didn't speak about adoption was she knew bloody well that that day they collected me, that my mother was in one room, they were in another room, my mother came in on the bus with me, the social worker took me off my mother and went into the next room and handed me to strangers. And I think that the adopted parents need to be very mindful of this. You know, and particularly if you have two or more adoptees, I find you'll have one that lashes out and you'll have one that's very grateful. And I see that with a lot of searches I do. So with the adopted mothers, they kind of have never really been brought into a lot of these discussions. And yes, fantastic to adopt a child, but you know, in Ireland in the 1960s and 70s, it was almost like buying a designer bag. It was very fashionable to adopt. Oh, we'll adopt, good Catholics. But we're not pets. In 2019, I was taken into hospital with sepsis and a perforated colon. I had a hernia that was about to come out. So all of that is from trauma and PTSD. And certainly a lot of us survivors in Ireland have diverticulitis, or we have, you know, severe bowel problems because we were fed gone off food. We were force fed from the age of 6 weeks. It moved our bowels in a way that's not normal to move a baby's bowel. So a lot of female survivors in particular would have a colostomy bag, sadly. I was supposed to get a colostomy bag, but I just said to my husband, bring in the Pope's medal, because I got a beautiful medal from the Pope when I met him, and I kept it under my pillow, and I said, I was very, very unwell, and I said, I have more to do in this life searching. It's not my time. And it was miraculous how I do have a faith in something higher, but not in the Catholic Church in Ireland. But I just knew it wasn't, I had too much to do with survivors. And I have made a recovery. Long-term effects, but greatly I have made a recovery. From the time I was adopted, the day I was adopted, I was very unwell with my bowel. And I went to a few specialists or whatever. And I just wish, I suppose for health, I really wish that I had known, you know, more about my medical records, or why did I have all this bowel problem? Was it trauma, or was it actually that was very real? I also wish that in schools that we were taught about adoption, because other children's perception of adoption and the bullying and the secrecy. I just hated the secrecy because I was grieving internally, not knowing the primal wound. And eventually, when people make sense, there was no counselling in Ireland for adoption. There is now, but certainly back at that time. In the school, the teacher's room in our school, up on the wall, They had the years and they had the name of all the children who were adopted. Very cruel, you know. It wasn't that they were looking down on us. It was perhaps to be a little bit more mindful. But the fact that our names were up there, I wish it was more open. And even today, very few survivors in Ireland will, you'll find the same ones that'll talk, but the mothers are still in turmoil. Like when I had my first child, I had my 16th, 18th, my first child. I had all those milestones in my life. And my birth mother, first mother, I thought that she had abandoned me. I also was told lies that the two of them were in college and were 17. And so I was given these achievements that I had to achieve, which weren't true. So I was told a bag of lies. And I wish I had been told the truth. I wasn't highly academic like they said my parents were. My parents didn't go to, well, my father went to college. My mother, birth mother, was from a family of 12. They all left school at, say, 15. So she was never in college. Those kind of things. And then you have to find your way if you're musical, artistic. And I had to find all those ways myself. So it was hard. The trauma, the deep trauma that is in your soul and that should belong to you. That's the one thing that belongs to us, is our soul. It's like everybody was involved in your adoption, or everybody has to have a view about it. And that's why I'm so open now, because I'm not ashamed anymore. I'm quite proud to have reached nearly 53, you know, with maybe perhaps numerous suicide ideation. Certainly is very high, and I have had that very much so in my life. Addiction. Adoptees are always trying to be loved, to be wanted, you know, so therefore we kind of go to places that we shouldn't go and do things that we shouldn't have done. And I wish that society would understand and perhaps be more forgiving, because a lot of adoptees have got into criminal activity. And do you ever notice when you're reading the newspaper, certainly here in Ireland, you know, it could be criminal and then it would have under adopted. You know, so it's just labelling us. Subconsciously, I might have been a people pleaser all my life. But certainly in my 30s, I think because I was single for a while before I met my husband, I was very vulnerable. And after meeting the Pope, I got a death threat. And allegedly from a paramilitary group here in Ireland. And then the stuff that was put up on Facebook about me was absolutely appalling. And what they said about my birth mother, and I became a target of hate. And I went through that, and after I went through that, you know, people throwing a hammer at my face and saying, when we get her, we'll kill her, and memes about me. After that, I just went, enough is enough. With people pleasers, people see that vulnerability in you and they utilise it. And people are, most people I hope are good, but there are some very bad people out there, very dark people. Even in my own community here, I've met them. But I just went, enough is enough. And I will now not go or do anything unless it suits me. And before, I was always giving people, I love giving people gifts, but overcompensating, giving my children money. Yeah, you know, it just almost going without. I was defrauded by a very bad man years ago, tens of thousands, and never again. And I think my husband has taught me that as well. He said to me, Clodagh, it's the animal kingdom and it's the survival of the fittest. And I living on the farm now, I see the dogs going after baby rabbits. And I find it very traumatic, but it is the animal kingdom. You know, and if human beings can't be kind to each other, there's something wrong with you. But unfortunately, because we're adopted, because of our start in life, we are. But it does, in your 40s, 50s, it gets easier. So, and as time went on now, no, I've turned my back on the Catholic Church. And that was a hard thing, and my husband has turned his back on the Catholic Church. You know, and It's hard when you lose that, because it was something that we had enjoyed so much. But we now realise that it's made up, they call us bastards, they're the bastards, the ones that follow that religion. But my relationship with the higher and my spirituality is still very much there, absolutely. I'm with my husband now 17 years, and I met him through a blind date. And I met him through actually my birth mother's friend. Very strange. But all these things come together, it's weird. So I drove down the country, which would have been, say, 40 minutes from Dublin. I was a real Dublin city girl, and I met him, and he was a farmer. He went to mass, he didn't drink or smoke. Totally the opposite to me. I was wild. He was very serious, very clever. He has been my biggest supporter to date, and I am only here because of him. I certainly don't believe that I would have made it, and I don't believe that I would have confronted the Catholic Church and the government for other survivors that don't have a voice, you know, because we're looked down upon, and certainly for myself, pushed me at times that I really needed to pushing, and to put adoption on the map in Ireland. It wasn't spoken about, being middle class, and, you know, I wasn't classic. I didn't look adopted. I remember somebody said to me, and it's like, what does adopted look like? It's funny. So I had 3 children. I never got married. Well, obviously I was in a relationship, and then that broke down, and then I kind of raised the kids. Then I met Paul, and that was it. We'd never had children together, but he raised the 3 children with me, and he's just been wonderful. And we have 2 grandchildren. When you're adopted and you have grandchildren, whatever about children, I was very young having children. I didn't enjoy it as much as I enjoy the grandchildren. It's like scratch and sniff. I can see so much of myself in them, and it's so wonderful. So it's an age thing as well, or maybe it's just the fact that I've accepted, warts and all, what has happened in life, can't change it. And it has brought me to here now, which is a time of great peace. And I'm so thankful for that. Adoption for me now is it's my life, and survivors, and reuniting people with that bit of paper that is so important to them. You know, people would say, would you prefer if you weren't adopted? I know no different. So adoption is me and all the other people in the community. It's become my life, you know, that even survivors come down and stay on the farm for a bit of respite. I can only really communicate with another survivor, as we call ourselves here in Ireland. It's very hard with my school friends or other people that haven't been adopted. I don't speak that language. I did speak that language long enough, and I was a little mouse going around. But no, I found my own, and that's it. From having worked with tens of thousands of adoptees in Ireland, I can say that the grief never goes. And it's very difficult when they go on through life, and our children, like my children have suffered. My daughter particularly has suffered intergenerational trauma. And I can't repair that. You can only apologise so many times, but it's so deep rooted in you. And imagine the day from being taken from my birth mother, that the diarrhea started and the bowel, that day I wasn't sick in the nursery. So that shows, how do we move forward? Healing, oh absolutely healing. The Pope coming here was a big thing, but it also brought a lot of anger with it as well. Talking, I find Facebook groups are fantastic. Beyond Adoption Ireland is a lovely soft group. Understanding, I think when we get married, our husbands, our wives, they're affected by our loss and our deep trauma. And it's like a domino effect, you know, that ripples around you. Adoption, everybody suffers because of it. I hope that we're getting better in Ireland anyway, that it'll never happen again, these institutions and the shame. Adoption is for life. For me, there is, that gaping hole. And it's not as big as it was, but it'll never close. It's my DNA. It's all that I know.